welcome to today's episode. This is the Music Mission. I'm Pani, and I've got a special guest with me today, very close friend from year 7,
Yeah.
Enrico Mainas.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, it's really nice, actually. This has been, a couple of weeks in the making.
Mm.
You were like probably the most excited person ever to be on this podcast, so I'm very excited to have you.
Of course. Yeah. It's a moral failing that the others weren't all as excited as me. They don't know
Yeah.
what they're missing.
So Enrico, I know who you are. I've known you since 2009. Could you give yourself a bit of an introduction, who you are, what you do? Yeah.
Sure. I as Penny said, we're in the same class at the Conservatorium High in year 7. I was a music student specializing in piano, which I did for about 8 years old, and then throughout high school, and then I did my bachelor's, and I was doing a lot of the normal piano-y type stuff. So I was a lot of solo performances, doing competitions, and was kind of on that solo career sort of route. And yeah, I had reservations about it, as I'm sure a lot of most musicians have doubts as they're going about things.
Yep.
But anyway, kind of plowed on, and then did my bachelor's. In my honors year, sort of transitioned over into research more than playing, because I like that a lot more. So then I was doing that, actually started a master's, but then there's a little bit of just circumstances, like a kind of job offer came along sort of out of nowhere that was not in music. I enjoyed that, and then ended up using this opportunity to just transition into other things. So now I'm in a Juris Doctor law degree, and I'm kind of doing that, and not so much music these days. But yeah.
Cool. Well, you mentioned two things. One was that you were 8 years old when you started piano, and that's, I guess, in the realm of pianists, that's considered to be ancient and old.
It is. I was wondering if you were going to say, "Oh, that's pretty early," or "That's pretty late." Yeah. It's weird. I've had teachers who were maybe, I don't know, a generation or two up from me, who said like when they were starting out, like 8 was pretty regular. So it seems to be a kind of recent decades-ish thing that like the starting age gets lower and lower and lower. So I started pretty young. It was just kind of a way for me just to give me something to do, something productive and interesting. Like, who doesn't want their kid to learn an instrument? And
do other things other than play Pokemon all day.
It's literally that. It's literally. If you ask my mum, she'd tell me it was because I was on my Game Boy too much, and I needed to occupy my time elsewhere.
Yeah, no, that's interesting how you said it seems to be in the last decade or so that we start younger and younger. And I guess that's kind of true with trumpet even. Like, I guess when I started, the average age was like year 4, year 5, and now it's year 2, year 3. And that's really pushing it because, like, kids haven't got teeth at the age of year 2 and year 3.
Right. I had a piano teacher that said also it's like the lungs as well have to get to a, I don't know, just your whole your body just needs to get to a certain point before.
Exactly. That's why violin can be a lot younger and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Which is cool. And the other thing was you started your master's. What do you do your master's on? What were you starting it?
I was doing research on interpretation, basically, and how we it was about a lot of things, and that probably would have been a problem as I kept going with it, how to sort of wrangle it down to one thing. But it was basically like when we look at a score and we use it to, like, when we respond to it in a performance of that piece, what decisions are we making? Like, what are we actually doing that is helping us to come up with a compelling performance? So how are we responding to notes on the page? How are we, when we think about creative thinking, what actually is that? How do we negotiate that against this thing of like deference to the composer, and there's a lot of talk in music about it's not about you, it's about the piece, and there's this sort of very disciple like kind of narrative that we use. How is that useful? How is it maybe not so useful? How does it actually clash with the immense amount of creativity that actually goes into performing a piece of music? So it was kind of unpacking that, and involved like interviews with people and some analysis. So yeah.
Well, I guess we can kind of talk about that today. It actually sounds really interesting.
Yeah, sure. We can. I'm happy to go deep into this thesis that I'm no longer doing.
Yeah, no, this
and
is
I'm not technically qualified to talk about. Sure.
Well, and that could be the title of the podcast. Not qualified, but here we are.
Yeah.
Performance interpretation. Okay, so that's a really interesting thing for me, because as a conductor, more so than as a trumpeter, I feel like I have more control over what I can say with the music. I'm not sure. Have you interviewed conductors?
I was only interviewing. I was only interviewing pianists as part of that study. So maybe if I had gone on, it could have been something to expand. But a lot of the stuff I was reading was interviewing other musicians. Not so much conductors though. So yeah.
So from my perspective, so as a trumpeter, you have lots of markings on the piece of music, and you follow them as much as possible to what the composer's wishes were and how they intended the music to be. And there is literally a single way to play the Haydn trumpet concerto, and every single time I hear a student play it not that way, I think, nope, teach them how to do it. And every time you hear a performance, someone who's like gone off and done their own thing, everyone just kind of goes, oh. But in the orchestral world, I'm not sure that's the same that's the same situation. And at least from my experience, I mean, throughout all of high school and throughout all the experiences I've had with many conductors, you just see them override a lot of what's written, and they go, oh, this piano, no, they're wrong. It's a forte with a forte piano with a crescendo on this chord, and we're going to put a random ritardando here because we feel like it. And so that's kind of how it's really, really bizarre that I've actually never thought about like the difference between my conducting mode and creativity. I really take complete control of the work, and like the Moldau, I just added a random 2-bar huge rit at this cadential point, and everyone was like, oh, this actually sounds really nice, and everyone just accepted it. Whereas I'm not sure you could do the same sort of thing in a concerto. Oh, maybe, I'm not sure, a concerto, or just other facets of music making, sort of.
Well, in a concerto, I guess it would add one other level of kind of command, if you would call it. So if you're just conducting an orchestra, then it's your idea, and like you said, everyone else needs to be on board, and then it can work. In a concerto, it has to be either one of our ideas, and then the other person has to agree to it, pretty much. And then although I would be interested if in a concerto the soloist disagreed with something you were doing, but that was just purely with the orchestra, so it actually wasn't a moment that they were playing in, but still had an opinion on how that should go. How
the introduction,
does that change the sort of weight of their opinion, or I don't know, are you more in a position to just override it because it's got nothing to do with them, or is the whole thing kind of both of you?
Because so we did a concerto together. We did the Emperor Piano Concerto. That was good fun, and I really loved that actually experience. That was like probably definitely a highlight of my conducting so far. Like legitimately, like was the best, and like working with you was absolutely wonderful. And I think we navigated that quite well, actually.
For sure. No, I think it was great. I thought we didn't have too many rehearsals, but we didn't have not enough. So it was kind of, I think it wasn't a good, I think things got good at the right time. I remember the first couple of rehearsals. It's just so funny because like I knew that piece quite well. The orchestra had picked it up very well. I don't remember they've done a good number of sessions just with you up to them. So I think
one, maybe two.
Yeah, but I remember hearing it, and I just felt like as separate entities, me and the orchestra, like I've had a pretty good like covering of the piece, and then some bits would just go together, and just because the orchestra's there, I just can't play play anything. It's just become such a little culture shock. And so we just kind of had to deal with that for a rehearsal or two, and then but by the end of it, like it was like we were doing. I think we were kind of past all the ensemble kind of concerns and just trying to think of cool stuff to do with it, which we did. Yeah, I listened to that not too long ago. I listened to that the other week just to, now that there's been some distance, and so I've heard a lot of stuff that I don't remember us doing because time has passed. Just being like, that's cool. Like this is this is neat.
It was actually very, very neat. So that's my view of like the how to interpret music, just really quick, like just like that. And I feel like definitely more genres lend themselves to more flexibility, perhaps, of like just you can play around with this a little bit more for certain genres. Like, for example, we're about to do, well, we were about to do on the 6th of August, but we'll see with the lockdown, the Johann de Meijers Lord of the Rings Symphony, which that kind of work, I feel like you can twist it around a bit more than others. For example, Mozart, I don't think you can do much with that. What did you find in your research and stuff?
I think So the stuff you're talking about goes to this idea of style, which people bring up all the time, and it's such a common sentiment that the more modern you get, the more you can be very, very wacky with how you interpret. You can be a lot looser with certain things, and as you go back to classical and Baroque, it's sort of it gets much more restricted, and you kind of just do what's on the page, which is. I mean, there's a lot to say about that. Like, so even just the idea of like you just do what's on the page, in terms of what that actually means. So if you have a Mozart score, which usually won't have very, very many dynamics, it'll have like a one word, usually a tempo indication at the beginning more than an expressive one, and just occasional like a piano here and then a forte at the section change, crescendos and but not all that much. It's not like in between all the dynamics, you're playing you're just playing a flat level of sound. Like there's
it's just a computer. It's a bass.
Yeah, you just can't. So in the act of playing, there's going to be variances that won't have anything to do with what's written on the page. Like you just can't do anything about that. So if that's going to be there, then you might as well take some control over it. So it sounds good. And so then, and then we talk about style in terms of, you have less dynamic extremes early on as opposed to later on. You don't see pedal markings in Mozart, but most people I know would use some pedal. They'd be discretionary about where to use pedal in Mozart or even Bach. And so you kind of, I think what I was wanting to get down to, I think where the conversation is still interesting for me is if we talk about style choices in terms of permissions as opposed to choices. So you can talk about it in terms of like, well, you shouldn't do this. You're not allowed to do this. This doesn't really happen in the style. It's against the composer's intentions. It's not on the page, which a lot of the language gets wrapped up in around that. And for me, and with a lot of what I was reading, that's a little bit problematic because then you're just talking about, it becomes the craft of it just becomes this series of things you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. If you're a student, you don't necessarily know. They just become you just learn these things as rules rather than, and you don't know reasons behind them necessarily, and that can be frustrating because you're just kind of it's like playing the Chairman Mao card game where I don't know if you know it, but like
I think I've played it once, and
the idea is that like one person at the table kind of knows rules and like makes them up, and like you get penalized and then you figure out what the rules are, and
I find that so frustrating.
Well, so when you're playing, it's kind of like that. You sort of play and you try things, and then your teacher tells you, no, you can't do that, can't do that, can't do that, and then maybe the idea is over time you've been corrected enough that you just start to do the right things automatically. You're not tripping the lasers. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which,
I
yeah.
had that a lot with my trumpet playing. Yeah, throughout all the years, like you have to do it
Mm,
this way, and I wasn't really given an explanation as to why. Well, I
mm,
was, but I think part of it also was that I wasn't mature enough, perhaps, to
mm,
fully understand it. I was just in high school, and all I cared was about Pokemon. And I was like, wow, and then go home and play soccer, and
mm,
Halo, and so
mm,
I wasn't me personally wasn't able to fully understand it, but now I'm just kind of understand. I like there's a thing about historically informed
mm,
performance, and
yeah.
like why do people do it, and I find the explanation really nice, so that when I am teaching my students and I am in a sense regurgitating uh, in,
Mm,
regurgitating this information to them, I give them the explanation
mm,
but I try and get it to their level. um,
yeah.
so yeah, that's
Yeah.
really interesting how you just said that.
Mm. Well, historically informed performance is just so interesting in itself, and like the kind of objections you hear about it are also really interesting, and that's a whole. Maybe we could come back to that if we have time. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's like the other side. Like when we talk about reasons why, and it's hard because at the end of it, it's art. It's hard to you can't sort of break it down like a science. But I guess what I was trying to do was sort of be able to think about it in ways where we're thinking more in terms of um, effectiveness, like efficacy. So everything we're doing is sound based, and if we're going to be able to come up with any reason for why we're going to allow certain things and not other things, it's going to be because it sounds better if we do certain things and not other things. It's very, very subjective, so better is going to be a problematic word. And so I was, I eventually got to using the word compelling a lot, which I think suits
Mm.
best. If you're going to you can justify anything based on whether or not it's going to sound, things will sound more compelling or less compelling, more
That's a
interesting
really
or
good
less
word.
interesting,
Mm.
which I think already serves the job a lot better than saying like this this is wrong or this is right, this is in the style, this isn't. It just kind of goes to, the reason something is or isn't in the style is because if you're not in the style, you're more likely going to to do something that's not so compelling
Right.
because what's on the page just wasn't written with that kind of intent. So,
Mm.
because there is a lot of like when people um, do object to how restrictive um, interpretation can be. It sort of can go down this road of like, let's just blow everything up and put clusters in Bach and slam the pedal down and do whatever we want, which is fine. But like, I think you can have a conversation about how we interpret scores without doing that. And if you talk in terms of more effective, more compelling, and less compelling, you get somewhere. So
I
you
think
have.
that's really powerful. The usage of compelling versus this is wrong or this is right. I think
Yeah.
that's actually really good information. Well, good terminology I could just use straight away with my students.
Mm,
So do this because it's going to make a bit more of a compelling performance. And in fact, I can just do this to all of my students, even classroom.
mm,
Um, and I guess that's how I approach scores as a conductor. Is like this will
mm.
be more compelling to the audience, but also the players.
Yeah.
Enjoyment in the actual physicality of playing the music to the
Yeah,
audience.
yeah. The physicality is a big one because when we talk compelling, and so the part of it was also this, like when we talk about what's compelling and what isn't, what actually is that? And that led me down a road that looked a lot at gesture and physicality, and
Mm,
if we take something like phrasing, so this was my honors thesis, was this was something that came out of that, whereas I interviewed a bunch of undergrads and just gave them just to talk, just had these kinds of conversations with them, but had scores
mm,
open and
yep.
when people are interpreting, a lot of what they're doing, like the word that comes up over and over and over again, is phrasing. Well, I'm thinking about how I'm going to phrase this. I'm thinking about how like this is going to go. It's all like intense creative ownership of kind of sound chunks at the phrase level. So
Yep.
we're not talking individual notes, and we're not talking necessarily like sections or movements. It's all like looking at things at the level of like at the line or the phrase. And so you just kind of like, well, this has a rise and fall, so we're going to taper it nice like this, and then the next thing does this, okay, and then maybe you can look at how those two work in context and taper it, and then you kind of like build this thing out of that. But you know, and that was interesting, and that was also logical, and it lined up with the research, which was like, well, when we're listening to things, like a kind of the most, I guess, organic level of our attention span when we're listening to something is between, I think it was like between half a second and 5 seconds. Like that's kind of how we're paying attention to stuff as it passes by us in the world. So
yeah, they did that for us in psychology. You have to do that in education degrees, and they demonstrate. It's like, all right, so here are some chunk size in it, and you do great. And then they got past 5 seconds, and like some people, you know, you try, okay, I can do this, and then they keep pushing it, and you're like, no, it's absolutely lost.
Exactly. So it's like, so then it makes sense. And there's so much, like, it's not like every single utterance of sound in every phrase, in every piece, has a marking attached to it. Even contemporary stuff, which has, you get a lot more markings as you go down, like can't account for every single bit of that. So anything you play, it's going to, as far as the listener is concerned, is going to have creative parameters that you're in direct control of that have a huge effect on whether they're enjoying what you're doing or not. So if everyone's playing the same line of Mozart that has no markings on it, and I play it with every note the same, and someone else phrases it, like that's just like completely different experiences. Very different levels of pleasure and engagement for who the listener is. But we can both say, oh, we're just doing what's on the page. So that was one thing. And so I guess when you talk about style, that's something like maybe the when you're doing things at this level a lot and join them all together, that's just kind of the aggregate of the decision. So how much so to take one example, you don't phrase something from triple P to triple F in Mozart usually. Oh, why can't I do that? Oh, well, it's just not in the style. If you stop there, that's kind of an unsatisfying answer. But if you but you can just talk about that in terms of, I think things we're all aware of, like in terms of like the textures that kind of music is written in. They just don't sound, they just don't track with producing that amount of volume from that instrument. So a lot of the reason you can get sort of louder in romantic works, let's say, is because, you know, we're having double octaves in the bass and using a lot more range of the instrument, and like the textures are a lot thicker, and we're having a lot more pedal, so you can make a bigger sound because there's a lot more sort of tools at your disposal, so you can make a big sound and it still sounds good, as opposed to if you're just doing that, you know, with an Alberti bass and one line in the right hand, it's going to sound very, very choked and strained. So you can do it if you want. Like, it's not a rule. It's not saying you can't do it, but just keep in mind that if that's what you're going to do, you're more than likely going to produce a kind of something that's going to sound very strained and inorganic. It's not going to sound singing. It's not going to sound vocal. It's not going to sound like a lot of these interesting effects that the music affords. You're going to miss all that in favor of this other thing that's probably not going to work. And it's probably not going to work because it's on the style.
It's interesting how you brought in like the notion of the technology at the time, the instruments and how they're developed, especially how the music was written about that. And that's something that, you know, composers throughout all of history, even to this day, always use the bleeding edge of technology from, you know, from way back to prehistoric times, where a guy picked up a rock and went up against a tree and goes, whoa, technology. And like this made a sound. They did compose the music within the parameters of what was available to them. So like, look at the piano during, you know, Mozart's time. Yes, it had dynamic control, but did it have as much dynamic variation as it did later on in the Romantic period? Not quite. I'm not sure exactly. What was the difference actually?
It would just be like, even let's take the strings themselves, and that they're made out of metal as opposed to sort of the gut strings of the like early classical keyboards and stuff like that. The pedal action is different. the size of the instrument is different and what it can do. And that's, I think, as far as I'll go with my very limited knowledge of the history of the piano.
Yeah, I guess the composers knew that, and Mozart would have started his piano and goes, this is how much dynamic range I've got. This is therefore I'm going to write the music like this.
Yeah. So I've been playing classical stuff where a bass goes pretty down low, and my teacher's gone, well, look, if Haydn had octaves, he would have put octaves here. Because he's put octaves here and then drops them for no reason other than he just ran out of range. Yep. But now we have the range, so just do octaves for the whole thing.
That is so interesting. In trumpet land, in like Beethoven symphonies, the trumpet part, it just does tonic dominant, subdominant, which is really exciting. And then when you go high enough, you get to the median. And so you can play the third. But you can only do that up high. So let's say if we're in the key of C, you can only play an E on the line just near the top F, right?
Yeah.
And so Beethoven has C octave, G octave, C octave, G octave, and then an F octave because that did exist. Yeah. And then when you have E, all of a sudden, both parts, boop, so you have the top part going bum, 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 ba, right? But the bottom part will go bum, 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 ba. It just goes up. And so it's the same thing. It's like, well, if Beethoven had access to this octave in the trumpet part, just put it in.
Yes. Yeah. And if there's any teacher that's going to say, well, you can't do that, it's not what's on the page, like, you just have to ask, but like, why? Like, how far are you going to take? Like, does it sound better if you, like, in what way does it actually sound more compelling if you don't do what you just said? And unless you have a good answer to that, then that's the way I always frame it. It's like, I don't think anyone ever says, oh, you can't do that, it's outside of the style. But does it sound bad? No, it sounds great, but you just can't do that. I don't think any reasonable musician is ever going to say, that sounds fantastic, but you can't do it, it's against the rules. Within, and obviously it's not as simple as that, but like generally I think everyone agrees that the engagement of the performance comes first, and respecting the intentions of the composer and doing things with a certain style are likely to get you to a more compelling performance. But like that, they're the means to the end. And sometimes in how we talk about things, we actually lose the perspective that they're the means to the end, and it just becomes about deference to the score and doing the composer's intention kind of stuff. Like that's the end, and that's what classical music is about. Which, before we hit record, we were talking about what topics we were going to do, and like burnout came up, which we can still talk about if we want, but because it's relevant. Like this, if the whole narrative around why we're doing what we're doing is going to be unfulfilling, and I was reading articles that did studies on students after piano exams and stuff, and just looking and they all hated it. They were all like, this is the worst, I hate performing, I hate this whole thing I'm doing, I'm useless, I feel like I'm rubbish. Maybe you're always going to get that to a certain degree in any high performance thing, but where if the reason behind what you're doing, your art form, is to, I don't know, preserve the music according to a set of arbitrary rules and kind of arbitrary claims to a dead artist's intention, if that's your objective, that seems to me a lot less fulfilling, a lot less motivating than your objective is to make good art because you're an artist and take ownership of your own creativity in doing that.
Yeah, and then now that's a great way that's perfectly timed to segue into historically informed practice, where they actually try and do that. So, I mean, the only person I know is Hamish, who sometimes listens to this. So, hi, Hamish. I don't know much about historically informed performance practice, to be honest. I mean, did you happen to interview anyone and get their perspective on that?
I didn't interview anyone. My supervisor and a lot of the researchers I was, engaging with at the time of doing this were involved in historically informed performance. I was never in that myself, so I'm not going to do a representation of that discipline, and because
we should call in Hamish.
You should definitely get someone on to talk about HIP and get into the weeds, because I think that'll be really interesting. And I'm definitely not the person for that. But what I found really interesting about HIP was that in some sense it's an extension of what we've been talking about, and the kind of the thesis of HIP, in at least in terms of how I encountered it, was sort of like, well, what we're doing now, like the performance idiom of the current age, actually leaves out a lot of, like, for something that claims to be so obsessed about composers' intentions and deference to the score and stuff, how we're interpreting it is so divorced from how musicians were interpreting it at the time of writing, that we're actually missing a lot of things that could be compelling about performances of this music. We're missing because we're ignoring them, because classical music claims to be historically informed. Like, you're claiming to be historically informed as soon as you're talking about composers' intentions and staying within the style. So if that's what you're going to do, you might as well do it properly and actually listen to recordings from that era and see what they're doing. And it was really, so like, one technique that comes out of that school, I guess you'd call it, is this thing of dislocation, which is if you have just like a left hand line, a bass line, it could be an Alberti bass, it could be something like from a Chopin nocturne, whatever, and a line in the right hand. What was customary in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century of playing this was that you would not exactly line up, like, if your first note in the right hand and first note in the left hand are on the first beat, you do not necessarily line up every single note with every single beat. So you might, you can delay things here and there. There's a bit of push and pull. This is the kind of rubato you're dealing with. Your right and left hand are going to be like slightly out of sync, which, now, depending on who you ask, that's either really interesting or that's heresy, because it's not what's on the page. And what I found, I encountered dislocation in my own playing, like, very, very organically. I was playing, I don't remember what it was. It was like second movement of the Schumann Piano Concerto, I think, and I was doing the middle section there. And I started doing that on my own because I got really into that. It's just beautiful. It's got this gorgeous. It wasn't the second movement. No, it was the middle bit of the first movement, I think. Anyway, this gorgeous, like andante or adagio cantabile moment. And I was like, as I was working through it and trying to like make it work, I realized something cool was happening if I delayed notes, if I like placed the left hand a little earlier than the right, or vice versa at choice moments.
Kind of like a rolling effect, I suppose.
Yeah, or like the not justification, that's stupid. But the I guess a reasoning that I've read was that it actually more accurately mimics how a singer is going to sing against an instrument, because a singer's voice doesn't just like come in and out like on an instant action like a piano note does.
Slight.
Yeah, they have to like kind of swell. I don't know the terminology, but they sort of swell into it. They fade out. They have to like that. There's a moment, and when you're accompanying, you get told this. You have to give them time to breathe. You can see in the sound waves
of a piano, like it's like a bang, sharp. It's a wall, whereas a singer is like a wah, a little bit. If you slow it down over time, like even if you look at our sound waves now at the bottom of the screen, you can see that most of our things have a wah opening to them.
Exactly. So if we're going to talk cantabile, if we're going to talk about a singing line, which is all anyone talks about when playing at least romantic piano music and prior, why don't we do that all the way? Like, why? Surely dislocation is just going to be, it's just the next level of cantabile. No, we can't do that. Why not? If your answer to that is going to be, well, but it's just not on the page, then that's just like a purely ideological argument that you're basically saying that, like, well, here's the rules of what we do, and even if we can get to a more compelling sound, we shouldn't break them, and so we just have to sacrifice good performances, which is crazy. Like, why would you say that? You might say, well, no, it just doesn't sound good. It sounds messy and weird and like, lurchy and doesn't work. And then you're entitled to that, and everyone can play however they want, and so it's better to have the conversation on those terms. and that opens up a whole different conversation about like, well, why do you think that sounds bad? And maybe someone in HIP might say, well, because the current idiom of how we play, which is so influenced by the rise of like recording technology and stuff, and so there's just been this incentive to produce like consistency and like perfection in recorded music, maybe at the sacrifice of some spontaneity, of some creativity. So we're kind of, our ears have been sort of retrained to a kind of very clinical, very very sort of clean and perfect, uncontroversial, consistent mode of playing, which is fine, but you shouldn't pretend that this is classical music and this is how it's always been. You should say this is the current style and it's different from the style in the centuries prior. And you know, we're all adults, we're all grown-up artists. We can have arguments over, you know, what sounds better and what doesn't. That's fine, but we shouldn't pretend that like classical music now is the default and HIP is some fringe like gang of weirdos who are trying to I don't know, put music in a time machine and do that, which is, I think, a very unfair criticism that HIP gets a lot of the time. It's so I think if we really get down to it, a lot of what the points that are raised in HIP, if you're doing interpretation seriously, you have to contend with them, whether or not you agree with them. So, yeah. I was doing a masterclass once. It was on some classical piece, and it was on Haydn, and he was saying, I really like this guy. I don't remember his name. I think he teaches up in Manchester or something, but he was saying that something he's noticed with a lot of like, you know, this the importance of the or text, like, you know, when you're picking what edition you're going to get, you should get the or text because that doesn't have all the editorial markings on it. You should get this. Now, there's a good argument for doing that. Why? Because if you get a very highly edited version and you don't know what's edited and what not, you don't know what the composer put in or just what somebody else who is just like you thinks, how it thinks you should go. So you don't want to be playing, you don't want to be just playing off somebody else's performance. You want to be engaging with what the composer's written and coming up with your own performance in response to that. So that's why the or text is useful. He said that reasoning, he's seen it kind of get warped into something else by increasing generations of teachers and students, where it's like, well, you should get the or text because it doesn't corrupt the music with all these silly dynamics and extra markings and stuff, and you should just play it, and so you just have your P here and your F 30 bars later, and that's all you do. Right. And so they're thinking like, oh, you have the or text, so you just play what's on the page, and then you're playing clean, clinical, respectable, uncontroversial Bach if you just, you know, keep everything level. And he was so angry about this. He was like, all it's done is just perpetuate like a whole generation of like uninspired and like very pedestrian and like terrified performances of Baroque and classical music, because all everyone's doing is just wanting to get everything clean, everything clear, and
so people can nod in the audience and go, yes, that's how it should
sound. Exactly. Oh, we can talk about too what that does to audiences. But yeah, like, and all they're doing is afraid of making not just a technical mistake, but like a stylistic mistake by imposing too much of themselves on it. Where he says that was never the point. The point was that you get the clean score. So by practicing it, you add your own in. You're putting in your own markings and stuff, because you have to phrase whether you like it or not. You have to balance the hand somehow. Like, you don't find pieces of music that tell you what to do in the right hand, what to do in the left. But every teacher in the world is going to agree you have to balance your hands. Otherwise, it just doesn't sound like... And, yeah, okay, why do you have to balance your hands? Like, where's that in the rule book? Well, obviously you do that because it's just more compelling to focus the audience's ears on a certain sound. You're not just giving them a wall of sound. You're going to guide them. You're going to give them something. You're going to give them a narrative. Like, so, you know, and the score's not going to point like what's, you know, which one to do. So yeah, it goes back to like the craft of what you're doing is like taking ownership of every single second of sound you're making in a performance and doing something meaningful with it. You know, and the score gives you parameters, like the exercise is reliant on like, well, the composer's written this. You can think of yourself in collaboration with the composer. So if the composer's given you forte, you know, I shouldn't play it piano. Why? It could sound good played piano. Yeah, it could. But I think if you go that far, then we're in different territory. Like if I just and I know of like really interesting researchers who experiment with like, let's play Beethoven sonata and just flip all the like, reverse all the tempo marking. So play fast where it says slow and play loud where it says soft, and they come up with interesting stuff, and that's great. For me, I reckon, I don't know, that's kind of a different discipline almost, or maybe just a whole different exercise to what, I don't know, just playing art music is. That's almost becoming like, it's almost composing basically, or you're doing music like based on the piece rather than like, I think there's something meaningful in, I don't know, defining what playing the piece is conventionally, which is, if there's a P, play a P, because that's the composer telling you like, this performance works, like my vision of the performance works if you play P here. However you take that, whatever you're going to do with it, because P isn't normative, there's still a lot of like, my soft's going to be different from your soft. How you phrase within it's going to be different. So, like, take what I've written as parameters, but within that, do everything you possibly can to make it as interesting as possible. And yeah, I think that's what playing is, but it's so rarely like talked about on those terms explicitly.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And also, you mentioned before about like my P is different to your P, and there's so much room within that. Old scores, if you look at them before the press and before, there were different sizes for different P's and different F's in scores. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but it's really fascinating actually to look at like a Beethoven score, like a Mozart score, and like they've written F, and then a few bars later they write F again, but F with like a big F there, and then that's why you get to Tchaikovsky. All of a sudden we have triple Fs and double Fs because that was lost with the print. They couldn't get different fonts very easily. So fun fact there, but you were mentioning how you want to guide the listener by balancing your hands, and it's something you have to do. And I guess that's what you have to do as a conductor, is balance a score. And that's something that is, again, embedded into the culture behind conducting, because it's really fascinating listening to all this, because this is very much a very heavy aspect of piano playing, which I have, being a trumpeter, I have no idea about this. And that's why when people say, performance, like interpretation, and what are the composer's intentions, it's really not that huge of a discussion I've had personally, or have had to have with people on the level that you do or think about it. And so as a conductor, I've just kind of gone into it with like completely oblivious to this, and I see a score, and then all the instruments are F F F F F F F F D crescendo to P, and that's cool. But there are certain lines that are in there, and so that's when you get your pencil and you kind of override it, and you say, right, well, everyone else is now going to be MF and go to PP, whereas this line is actually going to, and you tell the instrumentalist, you might remember, like, quite often I'd say, actually no, flautist, can you change that from a P to a PP, and then change this sort of this aspect of the music, just so that it becomes more compelling to listen to. Pieces like the Moldau, with its swells, is just really, really, really nice, and those swells are actually not really written out that. Not I don't want to say explicitly, but that they can be brought out in certain parts of the phrase or certain parts of the entire music, and it just makes it like that. That's why I'm re-loving the word compelling, because there's such an honest word to use that is just really open, but also communicates across an intention behind your thing. It's like, well, this becomes more compelling. So it's really, really nice language you've that's really sticking with me. I'm not sure if I explained that, but it's really good. I've lost my my train of thought. Here it is. so what I found when looking at Beethoven, which I think was probably one of the earliest scores I've actually looked at so far. Most of the stuff I look at is romantic and new works as well. And I found that with the Beethoven, I'm going back now. When did we do it? 2018 we did it?
20,
Jeez.
yeah, 18 or 19, maybe 19. Yeah,
I can't remember.
I don't remember.
But I did find myself doing that less for some reason. Or maybe I'm lying. Maybe I was just trying to navigate the concerto. I was like, oh, how does time work? But even tempo. Tempo, rubato, something that so we talked about lots of dynamics and phrasings, but tempo. So that's something that I do all the time. That's literally the biggest thing on my brain is as a conductor is time. And I do feel that sometimes conductors might want to put in pulls and pushes in music, and that differs from conductor. There's this conductor, I can't remember his name. I wish I could tell you his name. But what he does, he takes every orchestral work and he slows it down by like 80% or to 80% of what the normal practice is. And his intention is to really bring out the suspensions in the harmony and bring out the harmonic movement. And it's actually really fun. If you find that his recordings like on average 15 to 20 minutes longer, depending. And it's a very intentional choice to take down the speed to bring the music to a level that, hang on, someone's knocking at my door and they can go away. Yeah, so there's a conductor, but then you find other conductors like Claudio Bardo, who's one of my favorite, tends to push tempos a little bit more and then likes to end really loud. And he does a lot more interpretation in terms of pulling tempo and at the end of phrases and at the start of phrases, as well as interlayer, bring out the layers. So he likes to bring out his brass, and that makes me very happy.
Yeah. So where do you think, do you feel like you sit somewhere in terms of being quite, I guess, conservative as opposed to taking liberties with the score? Or do you just kind of feel like you just do what makes sense to you at a time?
I guess in the beginning, what I used to do a lot was I was like 20, still figuring out stuff. And, conductors don't really start, well, conducting career really starts in your 20s, right? Whereas like instrumentalists, you start at your age of 10. So what you were doing at the age of 10, I was kind of doing as a conductor at the age of 20. And so like at the age of 10, you're not really that inclined to say, I'm going to do this to the piece of music because I feel.
No, right.
Yeah. But you'll do it because you've heard someone else do it in like one of your like 20 recordings you heard, or because your teacher said this could be a cool idea. And so I found myself in the beginning listening to, I think I listened to a total of 27 versions of Scheherazade, like intensely listen with the score and making notes before coming up with my like Frankenstein version. And I always justify myself, well, you see, if so-and-so did it, it will be okay if I do it. And what I am finding is that I'm slowly taking more control of it myself.
Right.
I think it's because I'm just understanding music as a whole better. So I can kind of just hear the harmonic progressions, I suppose, especially bass lines I've become obsessed with, feeling that push the music and feel where the natural pull and push of the music is and bring out things.
Yeah. I guess like with just like more listening experience, you just get a better grasp of what I don't know what happens and what doesn't happen, like in any given genre, and so that just gives you confidence to then take your own, like to just explore those parameters a little. Yeah, interesting what you said about being a kid. You just kind of do it because you've heard it done that way, or your teachers told you to, and that's still, I think that's still. There was a lot of really cool research I was getting into that was kind of like treating that as the thing to solve at the moment. Like, how can we teach kids in a way that includes creativity, and that's how do we teach them music in a way that is not them playing just what the teachers told them to. Should we even, like, that was a question, or is it just a fact that you know, to learn this kind of thing for the first certain number of years, especially when you're a certain age, it's just going to be quite not mechanical, but quite sort of technical. You're going to be learning how to play it. You're going to be learning some things you have to just automatize certain systems.
Yeah.
And you just kind of have to
go through the motions,
do a little bit of what you're told and sort of earn your wings before you can start doing things seriously. Maybe like some of that is true, but that's not to say that the language of how we tend to teach kids can be tweaked a little, just so they're aware of what the purpose of what they're doing. I've tried to
have any students?
I don't do so much teaching nowadays, but when I did, I would try to do that in how I would. So I would, they'd be playing something, and I'd be like, okay, so what do you? And I'd play it a little bit for them, just so they could hear kind of how the piece goes. And I was like, okay, so what does this do for you? What do you think of? And if they're not sure, let's just start with a mood, or even if they're not sure, just start with what it's not. Like, is it sad? No. Is it happy? Yeah, but maybe happy is too simple, but they know it's more happy than it is sad. So let's just rule out sad, which, sounds like very, very simple, but it goes to, there was a researcher I was looking into who I thought he came up with great language for this, where it was, we talk about music in terms of affordances. So we don't say if you're learning a piece and it starts off very, very slow and then it picks up the pace and it ends very fast and excitedly, yes, interpretation's subjective and you should have the whole world open to you to, what you're going to think. But that doesn't mean saying something like that, oh, this is a slow funeral the whole time. Like, that's just obviously wrong, and it's wrong not in a kind of stylistic or ideological kind of way. It's just wrong technically, because what is actually happening in terms of the changing rhythm or the changing harmony or whatever, the tempo, it just doesn't afford that. So if you're going to play this accelerating piece with, oh, I'm going to give the impression of like a really sad, slow funeral, you're just probably not going to be successful, because it affords some things more than it affords other things. Which is like, I didn't have that, I kind of was trying to approach things like that, but then I read that and just kind of went like, yeah, that's exactly it. Like, that's like the language mechanism I needed to be able to look at scores and make sense of them. And so, and a kid gets that just by knowing, like, well, I don't know what this is, and I'm 5 years old, so I don't know the profound emotions of humanity that go into
if you do, wow,
music.
Godspeed to you.
But I know that this is not sad. I know that this is going to be somewhere in the realm of happy. And it's like, oh, so what do you think? Oh, maybe it's like cheeky. Okay, play it like it's cheeky. And they'll play it and like it'll be terrible. Like, of course, it'll be, because they're kids.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Well, it'll be. What do I mean by it'll be terrible? It's just not like it. Even if they can play it, but it's just not some. In all the things you could do in performing this music in this idiom, there's a lot more interesting things you could do than what this 5-year-old is doing. But at least they're responding to it and they're playing something that's purely their own thing. And so I've had the thoughts come across to me from time to time, like, is there something in letting kids play kind of badly for a bit, but they're using the interpretation mechanisms that they're going to be using as professionals, which is like, well, how's this going to work for me? What can I do with it? And what's going to sound good to me? And just taking ownership of their own music, rather than teaching kids basically to imitate what most professional recordings sound like.
This is also, I think, why classical musicians don't like improvising, because we're taught, right? I just made that link now. It's like we're taught like it has to sound, it'll only sound good only if it sounds like this, and so we were never afforded that opportunity when we were young to sound bad. While experimenting with trying to make it sound cheeky or trying to make it sound scary. And if we do start, collectively start doing that as a community, teaching kids, okay, it's not sad. Okay,
Mm.
try play it cheeky. It was like, it'll sound bad, and you're like, okay, cool. Now try something else.
Yeah.
Those kids will be more inclined to giving improvisation a go, which leads to composition, and composition leads to new music, which leads to
Yeah. Yeah, exactly,
stuff.
exactly. And maybe they will be like, I think there's, yeah, and maybe they'll be doing really interesting things with Mozart in that they're playing it in competitions and their interpretation of it is something no one's ever heard before. And, and they do a CD of Mozart sonatas and it's so cool. It's like really fresh and interesting. That's one interesting to do with Mozart. Or they think it's going to sound really awesome 90% slowed down and on with a synth and with different, and so then maybe that's more into composer territory or whatever. I don't know, or maybe these
Recomposing. Max
yeah,
Richter did that to Vivaldi, the Four Seasons. He did
yeah,
it.
right. Or maybe these kind of, I don't know, these labels aren't that useful, but I don't know. But or they do that, and so then they're swapping it and flipping it, and then they do an album of remixes and maybe they like rap over it, and then they just become and they're like a pop artist, but they're bringing like classical into it. Like that's and that's a different thing, and that's still, I think when you plant that your job as an artist is to do interesting things with what you're given, then it's just going to open up a lot more potential for where people can see themselves working with it rather than what it is now, where a lot of people tend to get quite demoralized. And I don't remember exactly what they were, but I remember seeing the drop-off rates for people learning music, and it was just kind of like after around year 5, so like 9, 10, 11, like 12, it's like people who are like learning classical music just get sort of, fed up and drop it, which, on the one hand, like might make sense. That's just, you're a kid, you try a lot of different things. As you get a bit older, you just, not do so many of those things. But on the other is, it looks like it's not going to be helpful to have something intrinsically uncreative in how we're teaching it when the thing is actually really, really, really creative. And, the creativeness of music making should not be lost in how we're communicating that to kids. Yeah.
So, yeah. All right, Enrico, I think we've come up to an hour, basically, which is a good length for a podcast.
Yeah.
Well done on your first podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Did I do okay? Cool. Did I?
You scored a
did I
10
pass?
out of, you scored a 10 out of you can choose what the denominator is out of. All
right.
See if you want to make it out of 5, it's 10 out of 5.
Yeah. 100. Wait, damn it. Oh,
oh no. Yeah. Thank you, Enrico. That was really, really, really informative.
Yeah, that
I
was
like
a lot
that
of fun.
actually.
I feel like there might be an elephant in the room that needs addressing, which is just that obviously I'm not doing this thesis anymore.
Yes,
and, we've talked about it as if like this is
right. Yeah.
which it shouldn't be discounted. Like I was doing it and I enjoyed it and I'd written stuff about it and was that this is, if someone asks my opinion on classical music, like this is what I'm going to say. But yeah, I guess part of that was I did find, and I was, part of it is that like classical music was just kind of a thing I did a lot. I wasn't as invested in that art form for myself in terms of the satisfaction it gave me. It wasn't giving me as much as that, I think, as it gives most other people who are doing it. And by the end of the thesis, like how we've been talking, I've been talking like in terms of like, the implicit rules of classical music and what we actually do and like how we think of it and creativity. I kind of realized I'm doing a sort of sociology kind or psychology, I don't know, sort of general human behavior thesis disguised as a music thesis when like I'm obviously mostly interested in all the stuff that's not the other the extra music necessarily. So I maybe part of that is what inspired and I was thinking of doing a law degree out of high school and I've always been into writing and stuff and just so I feel like my thing, I guess, is always going to be about people generally and how we act and what we say about what we're doing and the relationship between that and what we're actually doing. And so music was sort of one version of that, but I guess I'm going to live off of exploring as many versions of that as I can, I guess.
Nice.
But I'll still hop on a podcast and act like I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that'll be the subtext, the music mission. We hop on this podcast because we like music.
Yeah,
and that's
right.
our mission. Haha.
Exactly. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. You shouldn't have to do any more than like it. Like that's it's there to be liked. You don't have to.
That's just simple. This is
no barriers to entry. All right.
And I'm going to hit the stop button. So thank you, Enrico. Say bye to everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening.